technology. Welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here for our second installment of Books and Coffee. Please grab your coffee and your food if you want it, or tea once we get water, which is coming right now. My name is David Kiger. I'm the librarian here. I'm so glad you made it. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about literature, enjoy some coffee, and how else would you rather spend your Friday afternoon in 65-degree weather indoors talking about books? We're glad you're here. Last week, Dr. Heather Hoover introduced us to a wonderful book called Transcendent Kingdom, and in it she referenced, or the author referenced, and then Dr. Hoover also referenced, a quote from Gerard Manley Hopkins: "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." And today our book is Vesper Flights by Helen MacDonald, several essays and vignettes on a love for nature and that charged grandeur of God in the world. And our speaker today is Pastor Maggie Rust from Covenant Presbyterian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. She did her undergraduate degree at a little school in Bristol called King, formerly college, now university. We don't know anything about that here at Milligan. But then went on to Western Seminary up in Holland, Michigan, and has pastored in West Virginia, and is now here in Johnson City. So please join me in welcoming Pastor Maggie Rust to talk to us about Vesper Flights.
And for the sake of the recording, and also so you can hear me, I'm going to take off my mask sitting way over here. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Beth, for the invitation. Beth and I just met. I just got to town a couple of months ago. And Beth and I, in one of our very first conversations, she said, "I want to talk to you about books and coffee." And I looked at her and I said, "I love both of those things." And that is sort of how I wound up here and doing this. I am a lifelong lover of books, of literature, and I imagine that that is not something I would have to sell this group of people on. Again, as David intimated, if you have given of a beautiful Friday afternoon to sit in the library, you are probably also a lover of books, whether or not you've read this particular piece or not. That said, it should be noted that there are a lot of adults in America that do not share our great love for books and for reading. About 1/3 of American adults that were surveyed said that they had not read a book in the last 12 months in any format, print, ebook, of any length. We have a lot of folks in this country who do not read. Good news, that trend is changing. Reading is up among young adults. The under 35s of America polled said that 82% of them had read, which is far up from the 67 or so percent of the boomer generation. I am grateful, I'm fortunate to have had teachers who not only instilled the value of reading, but also instilled the value of reading things that you might not otherwise read. And this book actually sort of fits into that category. And so I wanted to introduce it by saying, Abraham Heschel, I am a huge fan of the rabbi, and his book, The Prophets, talks about the greatest sin being apathy. And kind of the inverse of that, I think, may also be true, that perhaps the most underrated virtue is curiosity. I think that Helen MacDonald would agree with me there. I had read her previous book, H is for Hawk. Several of you might have heard of it, a New York Times bestseller and Book of the Year. And that was really more kind of in my wheelhouse. I read quite a bit of memoir, and as a pastor, a book on grief and coping with grief is something that was always pertinent. This is really more a collection of essays. It fits in her training as a historian of science and a naturalist. And I find her to be driven by curiosity. I think that's sort of the heart of what she's writing. She opens the piece in the introduction by talking about a Wunderkammer, which is a German word, a wonder cabinet. And so she talks about these collections that were particularly prevalent in the 18th and 19th century of people who collected skulls or feathers or fossils, different sort of curiosities. And that struck me because I have in my home a shadow box. And it has things in it like seashells from a couple of beach vacations and pebbles out of the river in West Virginia, a little clay bear that my brother made at camp one year, and a bottle cap from a soda that they don't make anymore, and a pen and a name tag from a protest that I was part of in college. These sorts of little curiosities, these sorts of tangible memories, each one with a story and each one sort of giving a glimpse into my life, into my story. And that is sort of what she's offering in this book. Each essay of varying lengths, some of them very short, only a page or two, some of them much longer, glimpses into her life, into her reflections, into the world around us. And so she wants to invite you into that space, into curiosity. And it's interesting because as I read this collection and was struck by essays about the migration patterns of cranes in Europe and the symptoms of migraine headaches and the ongoing search of evidence for life on Mars, things that I am not very connected to, it was interesting that those glimpses offer surprising insights, surprising places of kind of connection and overlap. At one point she says, it's through the small and the located that you enter the universal domain of human experience. I think part of the reason so many of us are drawn to reading in the first place is that we're looking for reflections of ourselves, of our stories, of things that we recognize and connect to in the world. And so I could see myself in the chapter where she talks about encountering a wild boar out in the woods for the first time. I was struck by the same sort of evocative language I might have described seeing my first black bear and cub out on a hike in the Smokies. When she talks about the song of an oriole, which in Britain, where she lives, are quite rare. Here in the States, less so. That you can hear that sort of ethereal music. I can hear the bugle of elk, if you've ever heard that sort of mysterious song, and these places where we're connected to nature. One of the chapters that I really enjoyed, she's talking about experiencing the totality of a solar eclipse, which how many of us did that just a few years ago, had the opportunity to experience something so kind of awe-inspiring. And so MacDonald, though not a professed person of faith, is very much still connected to the wonder that nature can evoke for us. And so I found that paradox really interesting to lean into, because she has these moments of sort of sublime connection that speak to me on a very personal level. And then she's also relaying these stories that I have very little connection to at all, or can hardly see myself into. I've never spent 8 hours walking in the rain to hunt mushrooms under a log. And I've never spent the day on a boat floating up the Thames, swan upping. This is something I didn't even know what it was until I read her chapter about swan upping, going with a group of biologists and swan keepers of the Queen to mark new swans that had been born that year as property of the Crown. These very interesting traditions and stories and encounters with nature that are sort of otherworldly. And I think MacDonald in part, writing this realizes how estranged so many of us live from nature. We are, for the most part, much more urban than we were 100 years ago. In the developed world, we can go to parks and can be intentional about entering nature spaces, but those spaces all have boundaries. And unless we're really paying attention, we wouldn't necessarily notice the wildlife and the nature spaces, even though they surround us all the time. She talks at one point about how many of our young people seem more caught up in the glow of a screen than the glow of a lightning bulb. And that image sort of struck me too, the wonder of that. And so she's asking us, inviting us to pay attention. And for her, there is a sense of urgency in that, because if we don't know anything about the natural world, how can we then convey its value, our care for it, our love for it? She's very aware that she's writing in the midst of the 6th global extinction event, the climate crisis in front of us. And she says there is certainly a connection between what we care for, what we know, what we value, and the fact that so little of that seems to be this natural world. How often have we had these conversations with people, particularly around advocacy? And I will tell you from my own experience and from a few friends of mine who are climate and ecological advocates, people do not care that polar bears are starving. People do not care that ice caps are melting. It's very hard to relay to people why that matters or why that's important, because they do not feel connected to the wider natural world. And so she wants to invite us into this. She wants to invite us beyond living either in ignorance of the natural world around us or in conflict with. At one point she talks about a lot of these meta-narratives we have around humanity and nature are setting us up against them. Nature is a wild thing to be conquered or controlled. It's something that we impose ourselves on. And she says, how could we instead learn to be companions with nature, to see ourselves as part of this created world? She says she goes out and she studied field guides and she started to learn the different species of birds and being able to identify them the same way that she might have learned the names of the children in her class as a child. She says, how do we befriend this natural world that we live in? And how do we learn to love it without the need to own it or control it or impose our will over it? She wants to value the wildness of things. She says toward the end, if you go out into the wilderness only seeking revelation, it's very likely that you'll get rained on. Can we learn to appreciate wildness and nature for its own sake and for what it is, to see both our connection to it and the fact that it is other than us and we don't have to anthropomorphize it. She says that in respecting wilderness and learning to enter into these wild spaces, she has found within herself a deeper respect for diversity at large, which of course is something I think all of us could lift up as a virtue, as something to be aspired to. So to hold a paradox of connection and estrangement, and to have all of that sort of in the magic of a book, encouraging reading here among pastors and seminarians and students and a community that engages these deeper thoughts is something that I was very excited to be a part of. Thank you, Beth, for inviting me to be here. Because a final thought from the titular essay, Vesper Flights, she takes that title from a practice of Swift's, which are flocks of birds that every evening, right after sundown, the whole flock will sort of ascend to great heights. They fly on an average about 8,000 feet up above the earth, which is where the atmosphere changes. It's where a lot of the humidity, the clouds, have fallen underneath or higher up above. And so they fly to a point at twilight that is clear, where they can see these great distances, where they can sort of align themselves again to the magnetic fields of the poles and to the stars. And she says the whole flock does this of an evening and then comes back to earth. And she says we spend most of our time here at the ground level, just dealing with our day to day, living in the clouds and the noise and everything that's going on. But she sees these moments of ascension, these opportunities for clearer sight, as something that is also valuable, not just to us as individuals, but to the whole of the community. It's for the good, not of just the bird, but of the flock together. And so I think that her intention is to offer that in these essays. I'm grateful that we've offered a space to engage that a little bit together. And that's all I have for you, but thank you.